All right, everyone. Link in the description, archived, of course. The other day, Russia ran actual sorties. MiG fighters went into Estonian airspace. Now, this is NATO airspace. This brings up an interesting scenario, and it could get worse before it gets better. Of course, we're all hoping that doesn't happen, unless somebody wants to play Fallout real life. This isn't really a thing, so you might want to avoid the ghouls, so to speak. The interesting scenario is that you've got kind of a lose-lose situation, technically on both sides. For Russia, the lose-lose is that if they do not stage incursions of this kind, having already done so with drones, now these are live fighter pilots that are flying over NATO airspace. If Putin backs off, he potentially gets seen as weak by his inner circle. He might get fucking killed. This is the way that European politics, in some cases, can operate. You have to be a strong man. There's no respect for people that pull the punch, so to speak. So there's one lose. Or Russia continues its incursions and it just inflames everything with regards to negotiating with the Western world. It's effectively a show, hey, we can do what we want. Now, NATO's got a much worse position, though, in this particular situation, though. Let's say that the sorties run. Now, nothing was bombed or attacked or anything like that. It was just an incursion. And then they left and went back to Russia. There was no bombing, there was no fighting or anything like that. So Russia has technically the plausibility, well, they just went off course, it was an accident or something. They will keep doing it, though, because of the strongman thing, and they'll incur deeper and deeper into NATO territory. At some point, somebody's going to blow one of these guys out of the sky, and that's the other problem. Because to not do so means effectively admitting, hey, Russia, you can just basically ignore us for the most part, and you're capable of flying over all of Europe. If you attack them, then you run the risk of it being declared an act of war. Now, NATO countries wouldn't conceive of it as being so. Russia is not supposed to be entering NATO airspace, and so NATO, for its part, would back whatever country was involved. Estonia, the Polish, whatever it happens to be. The compounding factor, though, is that much of the rest of the world would not be particularly happy with the situation, and people would, of course, worry, hey, are we going to have like a nuclear war or something over this? Because the Russians are rattling the sabers, and so is NATO, and this is a difficult scenario to navigate. And it is. Ultimately, the only proper way to win the game of mutually assured destruction was never to have started playing it at all. That's the final problem here. If Russia realizes that it's able to act in bordering NATO territory with impunity without worrying about anything, they're going to take that advantage. It's inevitable that they will. MAD will have broken down because it'll be clear that NATO is not willing to actually back up its words with actions. If NATO does take action, then you risk war and you risk condemnation for the situation. Now, I think that ultimately, the only thing that can be done is next time, if the incursion is particularly deep enough, shoot them. That's what should be done. We have traded fire before without a nuclear escalation, and I don't think, I hope, that the Russians aren't going to start, kicking off the seconds till doomsday because their fighters that were clearly in Allied airspace happened to be downed. It'd be unlikely. It is possible though, and that's the risk, the calculated risk that they might end up having to take. One incursion does not a war make. But if it keeps happening, it's clear that Russia is probing. Hey, how much can we do here? How many things can we do before they actually retaliate against us? Well, you don't want that to be a very, very large amount. You don't want it to be, hey, we just flew over Krakow or something like that. That would start getting people nervous. What you could see is the fracturing of the European side of the NATO alliance, actually, because countries that are closer to Russia will say, well, look, nobody's helping us, nobody's doing anything. This is our airspace. Well, you know what? Next time, we're just going to take unilateral action. We're not going to wait for the signal from NATO. We're putting up our own systems. And they'll control them, and they will use them. Poland is pissed right now. So are the Romanians, for example. Now, can Russia win a symmetric battle with those countries. Let's say that Russia really pisses off Eastern Europe. The Baltic nations, the Visegrad group, the Romanians, everyone drawn up on the border decide to fight together. They don't even invoke NATO articles, and none of them are nuclear powers. So then they go to war with Russia based on the violation of airspace. They invoke one another's personal alliances. Well, you could have a huge, huge regional war. Russia, by the way, would lose this war. They do not have the manpower or the firepower to stand up against a bombardment along their entire Western front. It would be almost impossible for them to win that. Meanwhile, the rest of NATO sitting on their ass, we probably end up funding a bunch of shit anyway. And then in the end, if things get pushed too far, this would be the real risk. Let's say that some of the Eastern European states, they effectively throw in together and they just haul off. They say, you know what, fuck NATO. They might even leave NATO at that point, form their own alliance, and just attack the Russians and say enough is enough. Well, then, what happens if Russia does begin to lose? They're losing territory, they're losing lives, they're diverted from their attention in Ukraine because they're stretched too thin. What happens then? When you back an animal into a corner, what happens? They get much more aggressive. So the Russian regime, because they wouldn't be able to throttle back at that point, might have no choice but to go all in. I don't think it would still involve nuclear weapons, but they've got a lot of other toys that make the noise too, and they may just start indiscriminately shelling everything that moves. It would be difficult for both sides. Hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people would die even without a nuclear war. This is a bad scenario and one that we should be seeking to avoid. It would be nice if Western leadership could actually open more dialogue with the Russians. Hey, we know you've got a war in Ukraine, and we're pissed about it. And the Ukrainians are pissed about it. And yeah, we've been giving them all sorts of weapons and shit like that. Sorry about that. But could you please at least leave the NATO nations alone? But technically, they're not at war with you. So you have no reason to be in their airspace. We'll see what happens, but I'm not terribly optimistic, actually. I have a feeling this is going to become some sort of regional struggle because this is now the third time that it's happened. It happened in Poland and Romania with drones, and then again, more recently, actual sorties, MiG fighters flying for an extended period of time over NATO airspace, over Estonian airspace, which is clearly a provocation. It's clearly for a purpose. They might be able to say, well, it was an accident, their coordinates were off or something. That would be basically saying, ha ha, I can go over your airspace and then I can just say the devil made me do it, effectively. Now, I don't want war with Russia. I had no problem. No, Russia never screwed me over. But Putin's regime in this particular instance quite clearly was meaning to provoke a response. It's just a matter of whether you respond, which is kind of what Putin wants, or whether you don't, which he also would want. Again, it's a no-win for the NATO side in this particular struggle, because there's no plausible action that you can take to stop it from occurring without killing people, basically. And then NATO, of course, gets seen as the big bully. Oh, they were only in your airspace for 10 minutes, and who cares? Also, there's always the risk of collateral damage. You shoot down a fighter jet, and it comes down into the side of a skyscraper or something like that, that could be bad. It would be really, really bad. And I think that's why NATO did not respond, because they're like, well, if we screw this up in responding, then we look like goddamn chuckle fucks. That's about all. Peace out.